Welcome to On Strategy Showcase. I'm Fergus O'Carroll in Chicago. We were in New York City a couple of weeks ago. We were at the American Effie Awards Gala, in essence, and we got to interview a bunch of people. And one of the winners on the night was Josh Sellers. They won a gold and they won a silver. And I was thrilled to be able to get a chance to talk to them today because at the heart of this case is sort of an understanding that marketers who are nervous and understandably nervous about engaging with social audiences need to be willing to be somewhat flexible with their brands. Now, this industry is crazy about shaping brands. There is many hundreds of millions of dollars, I'm sure, spent each year on brands that want to define their personality, want to solidify their attributes, want to have control of their messaging. And a lot of that is understandable. And then they're very cautious to engage with social audiences because they're concerned about losing certain pillars in how the brand gets represented. I've heard that a lot from a lot of marketers. So when I was talking to Dan and this team, I was super excited that they talked about that same initial nervousness, but then overcame it because they began to see the positive things that were happening. So we're going to be talking about Josh Sellers. The initiative was Josh O'Clock, and you'll hear more about it. It was an initiative that happened organically in January of 2024. So it's a great lesson for other marketers. There does need to be some give and take around what many times are artificial manifestations of what you think your brand should be like. So there needs to be a sort of a give and take going forward with that. So I wanted to first talk with a friend of the show, Tracksuit, who are a supporter of this show, to talk a little bit about the Josh Sellers brand and the impact on the brand that this initiative had. So this is Isaac Siraki from Tracksuit. So from a brand perspective, how good are things going for Josh, Isaac?
Yeah, so things are going really well, especially at that 21 to 24-year-old level. Those folks who are just entering market, just able to buy their first bottle of wine. Awareness is going up from 26% to 29% during the campaign period. You're getting the same thing with consideration, a great early indicator of those sales, 19% to 25% in the same time. And what we're starting to see with Josh is their top of funnel conversion is 79%. 79% of folks who are aware of them then go on to consider them, compared to the competitor average of 67%. So really best in class at that demo, which as a whole under indexes across the category.
And they talked about the fact that January and February, which is their typical slow time of the year, they saw a 22% increase in sales among first-time buyers.
Josh O'Clock campaign is a really interesting sort of angle for a brand like Josh to be taking, right? They've got a very rich, emotive family story sort of behind the company, but kind of going into that sort of pop culture virality of Josh O'Clock has really kind of driven that personality in that age group. And I think what you're starting to see, and we can see this in the Tracksuit data, is we're tracking a statement in the data that says, effectively, does it have good tasting wine? And
Mm.
for that age group, 16% of 21 to 24-year-olds agree that Josh has great tasting wine, 7% for the rest of the category. Massively significant delta between how they're sort of approaching that demographic versus how the rest of the category is landing.
Isaac is partnerships lead at Tracksuit in New York City. Thanks for spending a couple of minutes with us here. So let's hear from Dan Kleiman. He's a chief brand officer for Josh Sellers. He's a part of the Deutsch Family Wine and Spirits Group. Kelly Carson is EVP, head of strategy for the Tom Brass Group. She's in New York. And Morgan Kriegel McLeese. She is VP Group Creative Director for Tom Brass out of their Knoxville office. Enjoy.
It was a dry January just like any other. Wine was in decline, and Josh Sellers was no exception. But the problem wasn't dry January or a seasonal slump. It was a category that's always failed to connect with the younger audience, until an unassuming post launched us into the cultural zeitgeist. This post gave us a chance to do what no other wine brand had done before: connect with the younger generation.
It's great to have Dan and Kelsey and Morgan here. Just so everybody knows for the conversation, Dan is CMO, Kelsey is in the strategy role, and Morgan in creative. There's an interesting sort of parallel in this case because this case was sort of spurned by an event that happened. Wonderfully organic event that happened. But my interest is sort of stepping back a little bit before that, Dan, because I'm super curious about the whole category. I'm a wine drinker. I don't know a lot about wine, but I've drank a lot of wine over the years, right? And I can see and feel the evolution of wine just from my own experience. And I've actually worked on wine a while back at an agency for an Italian wine. That was fun. It's the Antinori wines of Italy, which is kind of fun to work on. So I understand some of it, but that's a while back. So I'd love to know what is the dynamic in the wine category right now? What's really popular? What's changing? It feels a lot more approachable than it used to be.
Yeah. Well, I think, if I was being honest, the wine industry, to use an industry pun, is in a bit of a hangover, post the record highs of COVID, and it is actually an industry that isn't growing right now. And there's a number of reasons why. I think, chief among that is the economy. Obviously, prices are going up. People are more concerned about their financial situations, and certainly when it comes to imported wines, you have this, kind of always fluctuating impact of tariffs. So I think right now the category is a bit challenged. I think within the category, what we're seeing that's interesting is, consumers are gravitating more toward lighter, more approachable wine styles, most notably white wine. So white wine is gaining share at the expense of red wine at a pretty healthy clip. And we're seeing across all different price tiers, that white wines are starting to accelerate in their growth at a much faster rate than reds, which are falling into decline, which is an interesting, kind of.
Why do you think that is?
I think it is just taste preferences. If you think about how people are being trained in beverages, so much of what we have, whether it's in beverage alcohol or beyond, really is about refreshment. Kind of more, I would say, citrus fruit, driven flavor profiles. And I think it's no different in wine where you see, wines like Sauvignon Blanc, which is probably and Pinot Grigio, which are actually probably the two healthiest wine varietals right now. They just meet that light, crisp, refreshing, easy drinking taste profile that I think consumers are, more and more getting trained on, as they, make beverage choices, whether they're in alcohol or not.
Is there any difference between genders in terms of the varietals that are consumed?
Not as much as you think. I mean, wine overall is just much, much more of a female category than, say, spirits. Whereas, you have spirits, which is kind of the category that's for everyone and has pretty even consumption between men and women. And then, of course, you have beer skewing male. Wine really does skew a little bit more female. And as you get into some of the more popular white varietals, it can get, as high as like a 67-33 split female to male in terms of who is the buyer and shopper for a white wine. So definitely there are some gender differences, and I think wine has just a much stronger place in females' beverage alcohol repertoires than it does with men.
So one of the things that is sort of really interesting about wine, it used to be that it was and maybe it is still dominated by the big houses.
Mhm.
And now we've got Martha Stewart and Snoop Dogg wine, right? So we have these
Right.
blends and these. What is that reflective of?
Yeah, I think there's a couple dynamics there. I think the first is taste profiles, right? So I think taste profiles, particularly with younger drinkers, are gravitating more towards sweeter wines. And so if you think about the way consumers are entering the wine category when they first enter, it is usually tending to be sweeter wines like Moscatos or red blends, where you're kind of removing that tannin and that experience and giving them a flavor profile more akin to what they're drinking in other categories. But I think, specifically to the 19 Crimes example is, I think it's trying to reframe the image of wine a little bit, because I think, everyone tends to have very consistent first experiences with wine. It's either very cheap wine in college or, trying to drink it at a very kind of formal dinner with your parents. And that kind
Mhm.
of
Yeah.
first experience, really creates strong schema for this category. And then, wine it does have a, much, more formal, I would say, older, and that the consumer base of wine is primarily concentrated in the elder end of Gen X and the boomer generation. So when you look at the image of wine in the mind of consumers, what they see in pop culture, it doesn't feel, especially if you're under 40, that it's quite right for me at this stage of my life. And when you bring in celebrities, or you try and build an image around your brand, that image has to, kind of break that schema if it's going to succeed. And I think that's why you're seeing that. We actually have a glut of grapes. So obviously, right now, because volumes have declined, so a lot of the more what you call the big houses and the more, single vineyard wines are actually quite readily available. I think obviously the image of wine and the price point of those wines and the taste experience of those wines may be a little intimidating, to the, everyday beverage alcohol consumers. So things like 19 Crimes are attempting to kind of make wine more approachable for more people. So many wine brands focus so much of their marketing on product narratives. And I think doing so, they really kind of fail to build, a set of values that consumers can latch onto, and fail to connect emotionally as much as brands do, say, in the spirits category, who are, very out there in popular culture and doing a lot beyond just a bar, or restaurant, or a liquor store to build connection with consumers.
When I think about it, Kelsey, when you talk about it from a branding perspective
Mm.
and identity, I guess the beauty of the celebrity is that there's already embedded memories. You already have an understanding of who they are, because not a lot of wines are advertising. And so
Mhm.
you're picking up cues based upon the simplest of things, which is the label.
Mhm.
And so it's like a quick way to a branded impression is to use a celebrity, because other than that, it's tough unless you got a lot of you take up a lot of space on shelf.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, of course, the celebrity, like in every category, I think gives you shorthand. To Dan's point, if it's a celebrity that you don't expect or someone that you don't think of as a traditional wine drinker, that goes even further to create a different perception of that brand that stands out from the category.
Mhm.
I think, and 19 Crimes is a good example, but one of the things that I think about often, especially when we talk about kind of younger drinkers, was like the huge rise of things like natural wine, or even like quirky labels. Like the way that brands all try to stand out often does come down to like what the bottle looks like. And sometimes it's, brighter colors, or like things that you look like you could draw in kindergarten. Like there's such a defined norm. It's such a well understood category. Like anything that breaks from it is the first impression that you make.
But it's
Right? It's
almost
like, how can I be different than the traditional wine?
it's
Mm.
always been sort of a bougie category. It was always
Yes.
elitist. And I remember coming up, like everybody, I think, who's touched wines. And number one, I can't read the labels in Europe or in
Uh-uh.
Italy. So I
Let
think,
alone pronounce it,
let
right?
alone pronounce it, and I'm embarrassed to even ask for it. So the idea that we, at least in the U.S., have simplified and stripped
Mm.
out some of that unnecessary language. We've gotten the design of labels a lot smarter than many of the European wines.
European.
But I'm curious, like Morgan, is
Mm.
part of the advantage of being a little simpler on label, and certainly Josh's label is
Yeah.
very stripped down. Is part of
Incredibly.
that being able to sort of project to to a new generation of drinkers, of whatever they're called, legal drinkers. That's the term
Yeah,
these days, I suppose.
I think that's part of it, and Dan can probably speak to the history more, but, the name is not only recognizable, Josh, also pronounceable, so I think that makes it easy for people to ask for in store, to bring to a party. It's also, that label does stand out. It's really sophisticatedly simple, and the calligraphy is actually our founder's mother's handwriting. So you have this cool story when you buy it, you can pronounce it. It's really recognizable and it does stand out in its simplicity. And, I remember when as an agency, Tombras started working on Josh, I had friends being so able to go through their camera roll and find a picture of it at Christmas dinner or on a beach trip because that label just pops amidst a sea of, really cluttered dinner tables or wine cellars. So pretty neat.
Yeah, just to pick that up, I think the
Yeah.
label on Josh, not just for young or old, for everyone, is probably one of our single greatest assets because
Mhm.
we always explain it this way, which is it gives everything that consumers are attracted to in the wine category in the
Right.
simple parchment and the scripted label. That's the refinement people are looking for in wine. But it also addresses the number one barrier, which you mentioned that people have to wine, which is it's stuffy, it's complex, complicated and it's hard. And the
Mhm.
simple use of a first name in
Mhm.
Josh versus a dynastic or family name,
Yeah.
and the name Josh, like
Yes.
we always joke, it's very hard. Like in your own life, you don't know very many Joshes that aren't fun-loving guys.
Mhm.
There aren't, there's not like Joshes who are mean people. Everyone knows a Josh, and that Josh tends to be, a very good guy, and that gives the brand, I think, an everyman approachability. So it's kind of playing both ends of the spectrum about what brings people to wine and what is a barrier to wine at the same time. And we've had semioticians look at it. We've talked to consumers about it. And that, when you boil down the meaning behind why they like the label and the brand so much, that's what it is. It's got a very, it gives them what they want in wine, but it's also incredibly approachable. So it's a huge
Mhm.
asset.
So I remember, Dan,
Yeah.
that it used to be that you never brought a bottle of wine that was screw top to a party.
Yeah.
Oof.
Yeah. It was always about the cork.
Yes.
Now I'm frustrated as shit about having to find a screwdriver to open a bottle of wine. I'm like, why isn't
Yeah.
everything screw top like so many wines are
Yeah.
today? It's sort of it's sort of stripping down some of that elitist
Yeah.
what you would expect out of that category. And I'm sure there's a number of years when that was sort of frowned upon, but now it's sort of becoming normalized.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think it was frowned upon, by the supplier side, the production side, out of a fear, less about the perception than purely the impact on liquid quality, that,
Mm.
a screw cap would bring. But as you look at the way people are, consuming wine now, they want it in smaller sizes. They want the flexibility to not finish an entire bottle on the same serving. So the screw cap is, just a wonderful way to make the brand more portable. It helps wines get into more occasions. So, and I think,
And it can fit in your refrigerator
yeah, it fits in your
refrigerator.
fridge once you open it. So it's
Yeah.
got a number of advantages. And I think, it's funny when we talk to consumers about it, there is still the tension that you have raised is still there because you still have a very strong constituency of people who are like, if it's not a cork wine, it's not quality.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, we're battling through that, but particularly as the category moves to white and we're looking for things that we want to drink cold, we want to kind of grab. I mean, the core wine occasion is kind of relaxing. We call it relaxing. It's like me time, relax at home, or TV time for two. That is it's a very impulse decision. You want what you want cold, and you want
And I'm gonna drink it this week.
yeah,
I'm not gonna put it on the shelf for 2 years
yeah,
where it's gonna
exactly.
spoil, right? So
Exactly.
it's a lot less
Yeah.
fragile. How does a wine get marketed today? Because you don't
Hmm.
see advertising campaigns for wines. Is it just that you get strong distribution, you get on shelf, maybe you get product placement somewhere? Is that sort of the emphasis, or is there a role for, let's call it paid advertising or marketing?
Yeah, I would say it's, you're right that most don't. I think that's been the major distinguishing factor in a lot of our success is that we did say two things. We do want to actually build salience and emotional meaning with consumers, and we are going to do it with advertising. And it's advertising is very hard to track, but we're one of the top two, I would say top or number two spender in the category. But most brands, because wine is, it doesn't benefit from the profitability of spirits or the scale of beer. The money available to really spend a lot of time, focus, and investment on consumer facing activity is just not a luxury most wine brands have until they get to scale. And, fortunately, this brand has had great success, and there's been a belief in this notion of driving salience and emotional meaning through, not just advertising, but a full kind of multi-discipline consumer facing approach that has been a big differentiator. But I think you've got it right. I mean, the primary wine model is, get trial through bars and restaurants, get it, onto the shelf and onto display. And that those are, just the effort to get financial and resource effort to get those drivers in place for most wine companies is what they can do. And I think it's the brands that differentiate. The brands that differentiate and scale are the ones who are starting to build, really putting efforts to build, kind of a value system beyond product. They are doing things with consistency, with the consumer and in culture. And that's the formula that I think every wine brand wants to emulate. It's just not within their gift financially to do so right now.
So Morgan, let's talk about what happened in January of 2024, because
Yes.
there's a classic problem in wine, as we've touched on so far here, which is there's a whole new generation of drinking age young people that are coming into the category. They may not be exposed to wine,
Right.
and it's sort of this thing that hasn't been approachable.
Hmm.
But what happens for you guys in January 2024, and why did it happen, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, why it happened, I think I've gotten to work in social media creative a long time, and the internet's a wacky place. I think especially at the beginning of the year, holidays are wrapped up, people are back at work. They're just looking for something to smile at or bond over. And a tweet went out making a joke about Josh. And we flagged it to Dan and team. We were not on Twitter at the time, but we're listening on all platforms trying to figure out how people are talking about Josh and what we can learn from it. So we flagged this tweet and we wanted to respond, but we didn't have the password. We couldn't get into our Twitter.
And what was
So
the tweet? What was the joke?
I've got it. So the tweet said, "I'm not gonna keep telling y'all to grow up and leave that Stella and Barefoot alone," with a photo of Josh.
So Stella and Barefoot are other wines,
Yeah,
white wines, I
Yes.
believe.
Stella Rosa.
And lower price points
Just-
to the point about the premium.
yeah, slightly lower price point, sweeter, again, as we talked about before. I mean, Stella Rosa is, they have a pineapple chili flavor. So
Right.
you can imagine. And this guy was just like,
Uh,
he was on his own journey, and that's what we see, right? We see at that $11, $15 price point when like this is their entry point into real, like we'll call it classic varietal wine. And so it was perfect because it's exactly this, I think his name was Optimus, Grind was added to this grind. We owe him a big debt of thanks. He was on his own wine, kind of mastery journey. And I love that he, kind of had the pride to say, I'm sure he was maybe not the, kind of crowd pleaser with his Josh, with his friends drinking.
You got some comments back like, dude, there's, try more. Like, what are you talking about? And then some people just said, like, I love Josh. And then some people were, part of the journey, like, wait, there's a wine called Josh. What the hell? So we were able to work with Dan and team, respond to the tweet, and then also just talk about, this is a really cool cultural moment and it's authentic. We're not, trying to make ourselves something we're not. How can we maybe take advantage of this situation and tweak our strategy and tweak what we're promoting on these same channels, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and so on, to maybe reach these people that we haven't been as diligently in the past.
So, but it's interesting. This guy didn't necessarily have a large following. This thing
Right.
caught fire
Yeah.
That's what I mean. And obviously Twitter, now X, and it's evolved so much in the past, 6 months, let alone 2 years ago, but it did, and sometimes that happens, and I was just so grateful that the team was down to try something.
I mean, I think you look at that tweet and there's so much in it. It's funny because everyone wants to know, like, what's the tweet? And when you read it, you're like, that's it. Like, how is it that? I think one piece of language in there is telling the fact that he says grow up, which
Mm,
we talked about how conventionally the wine category is quite formal, that Josh kind of straddles that, like, you were accessible, but we're also what you think wine should be. I think it kind of checked a few of those boxes for people. It's like, oh, maybe this is what I should be drinking. I think the other piece of it is that he calls out other brands and starts an argument.
right.
We all know does well on social media. So I think the fact he like throws a bomb, right? And it gives people something to disagree with. Which I think then if you're a Josh drinker, you're like, hey, I'm with him. Like I drink this wine and I love it. And if
Mhm.
you're not, then like you hear his opinion, but it helps insert the brand into a conversation that's organic because people want to debate it.
And so,
Right.
how did the brand begin to, or did you begin to fuel it, or how did you engage in it?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing we did was we acknowledged that as a brand, specifically on social media, we had been a bit more earnest. We'd leaned into you know, our authentic story of Joseph Carr and making the wine in the garage and all of that. And we said, if we just suddenly start jumping in and tell people to grow up, it's not going to feel right. And so,
Yeah,
how do we do it in a way that feels, not only authentic to Josh as a brand, but also to a social media user? We always joke we're competing with like baby pics and puppies. Like, how do you how do you stand out? And so, we talked with Dan and team about what if we acted as if we hired some new, intern and let them run the page for a week, a month, see how it goes. Acknowledge we didn't know the Twitter password. Acknowledge we kind of scrambled to get on this. And then treat the page as, a fan might, and as a brand that is seeing what their consumers are saying and hearing them and then interacting with it. Dan, I don't know what you'd want to add to that,
Yeah, no, I
if
mean, I
anything.
think you nailed it, because I think, when you're sitting there on the client side, you're like, we had spent hours with Tombras, on our brand character,
Yeah.
and we were very tight and kind of rigid with it. And it's like, this is a brand that was at its heart. It was, we were about approachability, graciousness, being plain spoken and loving, like which is not necessarily the brand character you would deploy or we did choose to ultimately deploy. And I think it came down to a decision, and it was just a simple thought, which is, we as people are not one dimensional and brands shouldn't be either. And so we said to Tombras, guys, run, because there is something here, and this could be an opportunity to show a new side of our character. And if we do it right, we're going to get kudos for it. And we did. So I think that was I remember in those first, the first few days were, all the hand wringing
Chaos.
about being able to get our Twitter password. All of our marketing IT people were on vacation on the same weekend. And I think Twitter has a 72-hour ban once you get locked out. So, like one, we were fretting about that. And two, we were kind of going back and forth with our partners at Tomverse around, kind of, okay, well, this seems so out of character for us, to
Mm.
participate. And should we? And I think it was that, look, we can't be this one dimensional. And I think that is something that I've taken to heart since is like, no one on this podcast is a one-dimensional human. You can't define them in one way. So why should we be as Josh?
is there stages to how this sort of rolls out, Morgan? Was there an inflection point, and are you able to sort of point to that, where you can, and even in retrospect, go, this is when it truly
Yeah.
caught fire?
I mean, a few things come to mind. I think, like Dan said, we were all kind of three musketeers all in this together, trying to figure it out, and we were moving really quickly. That was probably a week. We worked with strategy to develop, what's a temporary, what we would call like a playbook. What's our temporary rules of engagement? How do we talk? How do we look? What are we going to do the next week or two? And ultimately, we developed a strategy that was just as diligent as the character Dan mentioned prior, but with this new kind of lens. We were collaborating with different meme pages at this time, which was a really cool way to test out content and see what was sticking. We were obviously, we started developing our own videos with iPhone. We hadn't really done that with Josh. It felt a little maybe too scrappy or too unserious for the tone prior, but we said, let's try it. We'll make some videos, and those really took off. And ultimately, I think the moment that I was like, oh man, we've really stuck the landing was we did a 4th of July post with red, white, and blue Josh and made like a very silly meme, and people were like, oh my God, I love this. And you realize not only was this wasn't a flash in the pan, we were able to sustain it and really speak to people.
So
in
that's
the
6
equation.
months later, right? That's
Yeah.
I think that,
Seven.
just to pick up on your point, I think when we, when we realized it was something, is when we didn't end, within a week.
Right.
The best decision we made was to say, this, we're going to stick with this. And certainly how people were responding, 100%, kind of gave us the confidence that we could keep going. But that commitment to, stick with it and, yes, it was still going July. I would say it was still really running hot, leading into Valentine's Day, and
Yes.
Morgan can tell you about what we did with Wendy's, which is another, kind of very bold move for a brand in a premium, premium category associated with refinement. But I think that the tipping point was to see it going into late January. Obviously, Chipotle was writing about it. Rolling Stone wrote about it. Other agencies had funny memes about it. And I think, once we saw that, it really just gave the team the courage and the confidence to really unleash their creativity.
I think the other thing that I have always found really interesting is like, it's easy to look at these dynamics and say older people who drink wine and aren't on the internet think about Josh one way. Younger people who don't drink wine are on the internet and they have this different relationship with the brand. And I think what has been really surprising and humbling when you really dig into like who's the audience, who's talking about the brand. Some of that's true. They are younger and like more casual and, meme sophisticated and speak internet. But some of them are also much older than you would expect and drink it with their children or, talk about Josh like they're their boyfriend, even though they have a family. Like you just see kind of these hard definitions that we give to audiences fade away a little bit when you have to look at how real people use it on the internet. And I think that has been a really helpful exercise in this brand because it forces you to challenge some of your assumptions. Like maybe there is more stretch here than we even thought there was.
So when you look at the business impacts of this, when I was looking through all of the social, I don't know why I came across or felt this. I got the sense that a lot of those people were probably first-time buyers of Josh. It's like people went out and bought it in order that they could put it on camera. Did you get that sense?
Yes.
Yeah, we got more than a sense. I think what we tend to see is after the kind of the peak of the December holiday window, buyers tend to fall off in Jan Feb. And, we saw a 22% increase in our buyers, with a lot of that driven by first time buyers, and I think that was, and we saw increased consumption versus our core audience of 2-time plus buyers, but it was that first time buyers and then the significant uptick. I think, we got a 5-point share increase in the buyers under 35 of the brand, in Jan Feb from when this happened. So it was, we had real kind of tangible movements in a period of time. Like Jan Feb March is like, it's like the doldrums of beverage alcohol time in terms of sales.
Particularly if it's a white varietal.
Right.
So, it was great to see that. When we talk about where we had all worried about what our existing drinkers would think about all this, it was a real moment of pride for them, because I think it was like, here's something that they loved, that now is getting, kind of a really big cultural spotlight. And I think
Yeah.
was the added benefit of, in addition to bringing in all these new people, and it kind of gave, it swelled up the chests of our, existing drinkers, and they joined the fray, which was so great.
Mhm.
I'm always curious when there's these big hits in social,
Mhm.
whether, it becomes like a one-hit wonder from somebody who sings a great song and then we never hear from them again. It's hard to repeat it.
Mhm.
Have you been able to sort of create, from a brand perspective, some social to sort of repeat some of this or come at it a different way? Or is it something that it really has to be organically created and you have to wait for it to happen and then jump on?
I would say it's a beautiful mix. There's things we do that we know will at least perform well, if not exceptionally. So I think about, you mentioned people taking pictures of Josh all of a sudden.
Right.
Early on, some of the best content we had was just posting those things in what we would call like a UGC dump. Every user generated content. How are people tagging us? How are they drinking us? Reshare those photos. And to me, that's always, as a consumer, as a fan, it's so exciting. You're like, "Oh my god, the brand knows I exist, and how cool that I'm getting recognition on their page for loving this brand." And so, we're able to that creates a cycle where people start tagging Josh more, so that's something we love to do. I think we've learned a lot about what sort of content does well that we create. I think sometimes that is more meme-like content with a really intense consumer truth. We'll work with Kelsey and team on how are we seeing people talk about Josh right now? What are occasions we know coming up where they're drinking wine, and how can we participate? Another finding we've had is when we'll make cocktails, which we used to not do. You would never mix Josh, 2, 3 years ago. But now we're interested in how are people consuming wine? Sometimes they're mixing it in things. And so
God,
when we do that,
what are they mixing with wine? Please,
oh,
I'm gonna
whatever you
die.
choose. We had a
Drinks,
we had a great
Gatorade, there's Gator wine to, all
Oh, God.
The New York Sour, which is a whiskey sour with Cabernet.
yes.
It runs the
Uh,
gamut from Helen, which is high class, to Gator wine. I think it's, but just to add a point, like it wasn't just
yeah.
what we did, socially. I think we sat
Mhm.
down with the Thomas crew, and it impacted two other things, I would say, that were big,
Yes.
huge for us, that came right after, which is one, we actually changed our paid approach, creative,
Mhm.
where we were stewards of our craft, often obsessing over wardrobe and, the scene we were creating. And, we started to switch our product comms to much more, I would say real,
Mm,
punchy, fun communications that, we really reevaluated how we could get people to try, different types of Josh, using the lens of how we communicated social into our paid creative and media strategy. And then, the memes came at a time just before we launched what has been our most successful new product ever, Josh Sea Swept, which was
mm,
a product designed to go after younger drinkers. And as we approached how we were going to do that launch with Tombras, we definitely borrowed the principles of the memes, to develop the campaign and our communications approach for that brand. And that brand is all about, the tagline is a crisp new white that's refreshing the rules of wine. And
mhm.
one of my favorite ads was, rule number one: white wine pairs best with chicken. And it was people in the ocean chicken fighting. It was, like, and I think we really learned, especially as we're going after this younger audience, because they are the future of the brand, they have to get into the category. And wine it has this social experience barrier. We can't speak to this consumer with from the brand in the same way. So it really was an influential point for a lot of, we call what we have a twin engine strategy, where we focus
Mm,
on our core and then the next generation. As we move to the next generation, the way we approached the memes has become a blueprint for how we're getting younger drinkers into the brand, because it was, the response we saw was so profound.
Dan mentioned this fact that like we as people are dynamic and we need to be dynamic in different contexts. But I also think when you look at that story of Joseph Carr, there's one way to look at that, which is like, he's an older person who had a successful life, and then his son creates this tribute for him. And this is something from the past. This is something for people who lived in a different generation. But the other way to look at that is like, this has always been a brand that's accessible. This has always been a brand that breaks the rules of wine, like all the things Dan laid out, that we're not some European wine. We are something with a name you can pronounce. And so how do you translate accessibility and approachability for a younger generation? If that is at the core of the brand, it looks different when you're speaking to one audience and in one channel than it might in another. But if that's the thing you can hold on to, it still gives you a center to the brand. And I think what the social moment did is it helped Josh to look at itself and say, like, if this is really what we care about, how do we do it in a way that resonates with the younger generation?
Mhm. And I think everything's built on some sort of insight. I get the pleasure of seeing things that no one else gets to see on the internet because it doesn't make the cut, but the team can write incredible jokes, design hysterical layouts, and have all these funny things featuring Josh. But if it's not a real wine drinking occasion or a real educational moment for our fans or a real consumer belief, it doesn't make it. And I think the paid media is the same way. It's all based in really diligent strategy and learnings, and I think that's a huge help.
When you look at your budget for this year, did you, when looking back at the success of last year, are you now like, okay, I need to be allocating a larger percentage of my budget to social?
Yes, 100%. And I think it's part of this twin engine strategy that, the benefit of, how media has evolved and how the avenues we have to connect with consumers, have evolved. We can be incredibly tailored. So I know when I'm, working with Morgan and we're talking in social, we can be very targeted to who we're talking to and talk to them in a very
Yep.
personalized and relevant way without worrying too much. Like, we're not worried. Like, we don't sit around fretting what does our boomer target think about this? Because one, we have the benefit of being able to do both, which is key, that twin
Mhm.
engine strategy. And kind of we're always kind of searching for those ways to reach people in the right context and speak to them in a way that resonates with their kind of worldview. And I think
Mhm.
media allows us to do that so much more now than when we were in an age of it's like almost the benefit of all the fragmentation is that you can be
Mhm.
enormously targeted.
Yep.
It is Dan Kleinman. He is Chief Brand Officer for Deutsche Family Wine and Spirits. He's in Stamford, Connecticut. It's Kelsey Carson, EVP, Head of Strategy at Tom Brass, and she's in Tribeca, New York. And Morgan Kriegel McLeese is VP Group Creative Director, Tom Brass in Knoxville. Obviously, Tom Brass is kicking ass in the last few years, and it's great to see that happen for a small agency that started off in Knoxville, and now it's probably got as many offices as many other great agencies out there. So, and doing great work across great brands. Thank you all for being a part of this conversation. It's been great to talk with you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Fergus.
Blast.
Cheers.
Cheers.
And we will see everyone on the next episode.